And welcome. This is Peter Winnick. I'm the founder and CEO at Thought Leadership Leverage. And you're joining us on the podcast today, which is Leveraging Thought Leadership. I'm very excited about today's guest. Today's guest is Adam Bryant. Adam is currently the managing director of Merrick & Co., which is a senior leadership development and executive mentoring firm. Prior to that, Adam worked for 30 years as a journalist, including 18 years as a reporter, editor, and columnist at the New York Times. I feel like I spent every Sunday morning for many years reading the corner office column, which then became a book. And you've written two books since then. The most recent book is The CEO Test, Master the Challenges That Make or Break All Leaders, published by Harvard Business Review. So welcome aboard, Adam. Thank you for spending some time with us.
Thank you, Peter.
So I want to sort of talk about your path because it's an interesting one. So journalist, author, advisor, and then you sort of crossed over to the dark side or the light side, depending on your perspective of the business side of this. So sort of tell me the Adam story a little bit.
Sure. I guess it goes along two tracks. I mean, from the time I was in my early 20s, I wanted to be a journalist and dreamed of someday working at the New York Times, and got there when I was 29, spent 10 years as a reporter, went to Newsweek magazine as a writer, then went in the editing side, went back to the Times for 11 years. And during those 11 years, I was an editor on many desks, always running teams of reporters. But in 2009, I started this side project called Corner Office.
So beware the side projects, because I've heard more thought leaders say it started at this random, this thing, right?
Exactly. You got your day job, and then you got the side hustle. So Corner Office was launched on a very simple what if, which is, what if I sat down with CEOs and never asked them a single question about their companies, and instead just asked them about leadership lessons they've learned over the course of their lives and how they think about these sort of timeless themes about culture and hiring and talent. And so that, I was doing that while I was doing my day job, never missed a week over a decade, interviewed 525 CEOs, wrote a couple of books, started teaching, and just kind of reached a point where I wanted to turn the side project into my day job. And it was a pretty natural transition. The CEO of my current firm was one of the 525 CEOs I interviewed. So that's how I met him. And, ultimately it's about helping people shorten the learning curve of leadership. And that has, for me, been the kind of through line that if I can interview leaders and get them to share their best stories and insights and tools and tips, that maybe that helps make some people better leaders.
So what I always found interesting about the Corner Office is, most of what you'd read in the Sunday business section of the Times or any of the section is the stuff you'd expect. Company A bought Company B, earnings came out, the Fed just said this, blah, 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 et cetera. But the stuff that you asked, it was always interesting, and you pointed out, you never asked them about the business. You would ask them, well, what was your first job as a kid? And they tell you, they were cleaning barns, or, who influenced them, and, they're single parent or whatever. And it helped understand, it helped people understand sort of the humanity underneath it, or what drove them, or in some cases, sort of some of the dysfunctions that they overcame to get to where they are that weren't part of the public persona. So I think that theme was really intriguing.
Yeah, and part of the insight for me was that the business press pretty much always interviews CEOs as strategists. It's almost like the football coaches, right? Like, how are you going to win this Sunday? And what about the other team? And that's fine. And football coaches, spend all their time thinking about leadership, but people rarely ask them about that. It's all about the results. And part of that insight for me, I mean, I was a business reporter for many years, interviewed a lot of CEOs through that kind of traditional lens of tell me about the industry and your strategy. And I just found during the course of those interviews, I started thinking, it's like, these people seem really smart, fast brains, good sense of humor, some wisdom. Like, what if we just set aside all those usual questions and basically say, like, how do you do what you do? And how did you learn to do what you do?
Or sometimes, why do you do what you do?
Exactly. And, what's interesting for me, you mentioned the word humanity, every week I had this little kind of experiment of like, what are the questions I can ask? What are the best questions that will get them off their scripts and help me understand them? And over time, I just developed a system that I always started with the same three questions. Tell me about when you were a kid, like what were you doing outside of class? Tell me about your parents or whoever raised you, like what did they do? And then the third question was, how have your parents influenced your leadership style today? And I always felt, Peter, once I had the answer to those three questions, it's like, I got you. Like, I understand just where that sort of intrinsic motivation comes from. Because
and it must have driven some of the corp comm folks nuts, because they're used to giving them, here's the 5 bullets, and it doesn't matter what they ask you. The answers to every question are, we're growing this year, our CAGR is this, and
Exactly. I mean, it was refreshing to me when the PR people would sometimes turn to me, and because I'd always do the interviews in person, they would often bring a PR person, and they would turn to me and say, I couldn't prep my CEO for this interview. Well, exactly. It's like, that's a victory.
Exactly. So talk about it from the standpoint of your journey as a thought leader, right? So I want to understand it's a different business model. So being a journalist is a business model. You write, you get paid sometimes, right?
Right.
Sometimes more than others. How did you decide to transition onto the other side? So obviously you mentioned you met the CEO of Merrick as one of your interviewees, but what was it about you sort of going over to the other side on the leadership development and such that Merrick does that was intriguing to you?
Well, part of it, I developed a sense of how things work through my hundreds of interviews, but it's been a great new chapter. My learning curve has been wonderfully steep to go inside these large corporations and to work directly with leaders and leadership teams. And that's the good news, is that's only kind of reinforced my understanding and insights about some of the broader leadership challenges. I have to say, I'm still very much using my journalism muscles. I've got 4 interview series going on LinkedIn with board directors, CEOs, CHROs. And I just wrote this book. I write a monthly column. And ultimately, to me, I'd probably say the through line, Peter, is just, I sometimes think my only skill in life is pattern recognition. That, if you show me like 500 things, like I'll start noticing the patterns. And because with my approach with my interviews is always to just ask these super open-ended questions, then, at this point, I've got like about 6 million words from all the transcripts that I've done. And, to me, at some point, that qualitative data becomes quantitative and the patterns emerge.
So stay there a second, because I think that, and I've seen this before, there are a lot more similarities than one would think in a top-rate journalist and a top-rate consultant. How they answer questions, so if I put on my consultant hat, what does a great consultant do? Right? They ask the right questions. They get to the heart of it. They understand the patterns. Now, they do have frameworks, processes, methodologies, et cetera, that they draw on. But I think there's a piece, one of my downsides of being a consultant is I see everything as a Venn diagram. That Venn diagram of journalist to consultant is pretty strong. So when you transition to the consulting side, even though that title is very different, how different or not is journalism from consulting?
I think it's awfully similar. And you just said, the mental muscles are the same. It's pattern recognition. I like what you just described, this idea of like getting to the essence of an issue. And in many ways, I feel like, I was an editor for 14 years, all in, worked with, hundreds of reporters on thousands of stories. Sure. And ultimately that muscle, when you're talking to a reporter and thinking, okay, I've got to walk into a meeting, page 1 meeting at the Times and pitch this to 40 people. Sure. I need to get to the essence of it in my head. I need to get the 12-word pitch on this idea. And I would push the reporters and to the point where I would finally nail that. And, you can call that critical thinking. You can call that getting to the essence of something. But I do find, the first chapter in the book is about the simple word strategy and what that means. Right. And so many companies go through the strategy exercise. And, to be honest, Peter, it's not really strategy that they come up with. And it is that kind of like editor brain, that critical thinking that essentially says like, you got to push. There more work needs to be done to make this clearer and more concise. And it needs more critical thinking to get to the essence of it.
Yep. If you're enjoying this episode of Leveraging Thought Leadership, please make sure to subscribe. If you'd like to help spread the word about our podcast, please leave us a review and share it with your friends. We're available on Apple Podcast and on all major listening apps, as well as at thoughtleadershipleverage.com/podcasts. So I want to touch on something else that you said, because a great consultant and a great journalist also typically have a little bit of ADD, and they do a little bit with a lot, right? So if I couldn't even imagine, you just mentioned 6 million words, and I can't even imagine the thousands of different business stories that you've touched, and you take a little bit away from that. And sometimes those patterns are interdisciplinary, right? And one of the benefits of journalists/consultants is, I've got some clients in this industry over here that my current clients never know about, talk to, the manufacturing folks don't know anything about farm, and the tech folks don't know anything about logistics, but you start to see things
Yeah.
and sort of cross-pollinate that. How is that, if it has played for you?
No, it really has, and just the way my brain works. I mean, I do have kind of ADD. I'm interested in everything, and because I'm so fascinated about leadership, I've been developing this sort of library of clips from movies and TV shows that contain a powerful lesson about leadership, and I'm often like super impressed with these TV writers because it's like, you've never, if you're a TV writer, I'm not sure you've ever like been in a corporate setting, but somehow you have this insight, this fundamental insight about leadership. So,
well, that's just interesting because you don't have to be. I mean, people think that, or I think the default way that people think is that leadership is a corporate thing, and I think that you just touched on. A good Girl Scout troop has a leader, right? A school has a leader, a team has a leader. They might not be anointed as such officially, but leadership comes out everywhere.
It does. And to me, look, leadership is one of those super sprawling topics, right? Sure. At some level, leadership is about everything. And the framework that I use in my head is like, when you read something, when you hear something about leadership, to me, it's one of two categories. Like, is it a reminder or is it a new insight or is it an insight? Because, anybody can say to you, it's like, hey, Peter, did you know that leadership is about communication? You go, I kind of knew that, it's a good reminder. But when you see like a clip on The Sopranos of, Tony telling an intentionally stupid joke to test Carmela's theory that people laugh at his jokes just because they work for him, and him having that like slow blink of recognition, that's an important insight about leadership, which is careful how funny your jokes become as you move up.
And I think there's not just The Sopranos, but Goodfellas, The Godfather, are some of the greatest leadership lessons. As a New York guy that loves all of that stuff, part of the reason you love it is, I love it, at least for me, it's not just the violence and the intensity, but it's this leadership and not the way we're used to it. Right.
And to me, that's the point, because look, I think leadership is probably the most important thing, right? That's why I'm so passionate about it, because great leaders can elevate people's lives and organizations. And we've seen what bad leaders can do as well. So I think it's hugely important. And I also think that there's just a lot, look, I'll be very blunt with you, Peter. I think there's a lot of kind of gunk in this space. Anybody can say anything about leadership, and it's not going to be wrong. I just think that people need to be a little more demanding.
So let me take that to where I was going. So I agree with you that there's a lot of breadcrumbs in the leadership meatball, right?
That's good. Right? I'll take that metaphor.
Take that. There you go. Which leads me to sort of my focus, which is thought leadership, right? So there's lazy leadership from a thought leadership perspective, which is regurgitation or telling me something obvious or whatever. But talk about it through the lens of thought leadership. So like your new book, Master the Challenges That Make or Break All Leaders, I would assume, given your sort of high bar, et cetera, on leadership, there's probably stuff in there I haven't seen before or haven't read before or thought of in that way before.
Yeah, I would hope so. And ultimately, you and the other readers are going to be the judge on whether we succeed. But to me, the upstream work is really important. And my co-author, Kevin, and I, we did a lot of work to be really clear on the questions that we wanted to ask and answer. And one of them is contained in the subtitle, which is, well, what are the challenges that make or break all leaders? Why do people succeed or fail in these roles? And yes, you could say there's 300 reasons, but what are the most important 7? That's the discipline. The other thing that we did is, like, people in our society treat CEOs like they're a subspecies of the human race, right? Like they're different. And we said, well, what if we flipped that script and said, how are they the same as all leaders? What are the tests that all leaders face? And then what can we learn from CEOs on the front lines about how to do these well?
So let's stay with that, because I'm trying to understand from a thought leadership perspective, and what you just described, maybe intentionally or not, is thought leadership, right? So everybody assumes that a CEO is a subset of, and you flipped it. So you took a standard way of thinking that is not even controversial. Oh, this is just the way of, like the earth is round. And so what if I looked at it a different way? And that's an example of thought leadership.
It is. And in many ways, to me, it's part of sort of the journalism muscles that I developed. And maybe they're also the same as consultant muscles. But in all my years at the newsroom, at the Times, there's this expression, the art of the good dumb question. And I think that is an important art form. That art form led me to say, what if I sat down with CEOs and never asked them about their companies? And And I don't write books because I wake up with an idea. I wake up with the question. To me, it's all about getting the question right. And I'd like to think there's a good, dumb underlying question under each of my 3 books that led me to write those. And to me, that's part of like, what is the new question? Where people go like, I haven't seen it framed that way. And on the one hand, it seems kind of obvious. It's almost like a New Yorker cartoon, right? Like sometimes when you see New Yorker, it's like, hasn't somebody done that cartoon before? That's so obvious. So to me, that's part of the magic.
No, I love that. I love it. And I think that's the difference between a seasoned journalist or consultant and one that's not. So you can have a really brilliant young whatever at a big consulting firm, a 28-year-old at Accenture that's gone through amazing training and great frameworks and great methodologies, but they haven't built their own questioning muscles. So they're sort of just reading from the book, if you will, and following the playbook, which is fine in some instances, but you don't gain the insight, the thing that's, that you were one question away from the breakthrough that made a difference between doing a good job and doing a great job.
Yeah, and you do have to spend time in whatever field to discover that sort of obvious thing, right? And there's a book I read many years ago. It was just one of these classic adventure things, and there was this image that really stuck in my head. And talking about like they were these 2 guys in a canoe. They were essentially lost and going from like lake to lake, and they said, what was disheartening is because you get to the new lake and you can't see the tributaries, right?
Sure.
So you literally have to paddle around the entire lake to find the one way out of it. And to me, like that image stayed with me. And, I sort of feel like I have spent a lot of time paddling around the Leadership Lake, looking for those kind of new little tributaries just to find that one thing. It's like, wait, that's new.
Well, sometimes it might just appear as a nuance, but then you use the analogy, you paddle in deeper, and you're like, oh, wait a minute, it's more than just a slight nuance. It makes all the difference,
right? And context. Yeah, and for me, it's like, look, I've trained as a journalist. I didn't go to business school, and just spending enough time, especially now inside big companies, and having this insight, it's like, wait a minute. Strategy is a Rorschach test. It is a classic ink blot. That simple word that I used to assume meant the same thing to everybody. Everybody's got a different opinion about it. And to me, it's like I could only get that insight through time and experience.
Yeah. And it's interesting that something as clear cut, theoretically, or well-defined, I should say, as strategy, people put things out there and say, tell me your strategy. You're like, no, you just told me 5 tactics. Let's tell me your strategy. No, that's your social media. No. You're like, okay, let's go backwards. And because you don't want to be patronizing and say, well, how are you thinking about strategy? How do you define it? Right. And it's not a series of activities, right? That's what I do every day.
Right.
And I think that for some reason in different organizations, whatever the case may be, the clarity around what strategy is and the power of a good strategy gets diluted because activity is not productive. We're so busy doing stuff.
Right. And to me, once you agree that is a phenomenon, then the question becomes, well, why is that? And I think there's a couple of reasons. One is I think people just sort of naturally go to, safer things, right? Because if you're a CEO, you're going to put your job at risk if you have a really clear and ambitious strategy. It's much safer to say, well, we're going to look for high, return opportunities and be industry leading, blah, 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 right? Like that's not a strategy. That's a description of what companies do. But it's much safer. You sort of like, that's our strategy. I can ride that out for like 7 years, right?
Right. Being at the top quartile of our industry is not a strategy, it's an outcome.
Right, exactly. And I think the other problem, and again, there's a parallel with my journalism years, a lot of the times when I would talk to reporters before they'd start writing their stories, I would say to them, Peter, I say, you are suffering from the most noble disease of great reporters. You are suffering from expertitis. You are too close to this subject, right? And it's hard for you to sort of step back and think about like the reader is coming to it cold. And I think that happens in business as well. People grow up in companies, they grow up in industries, and what is so clear and obvious to them is not clear and obvious to anybody.
I love that you say that, because I call it curse of the expert. And oftentimes they'll say, because I'm dealing with amazingly smart people, top of their game across every discipline across the world. And I say, oh, hold on. Tell it to me as if I'm in 3rd grade, because in your domain I am, right? Talk to me as if I just landed from another planet, because you're assuming, because you're so entrenched in it, that everybody else is as experienced and whatever. And most people won't raise their hands and say, hey, Adam, I'm an idiot. I didn't really understood what you said. So I'm just going to shake my head and go, But right. I think people appreciate when you say, wait a minute, stop, slow it down a little bit and unpack that for me a bit.
Yeah. And I think the third thing is just like things are just more complicated. There's this bias in the business world to make things more complicated than they need to be, to reach for the $20 word when a 5-cent word would do just fine. Yeah. And so you and I have seen all of those strategy slides where there's, you know what they look like, right? There's 7 bullet points on the right-hand side. Right. There's a color tiered pyramid on the left-hand side with like corkscrew arrows and a lot of words in it. And you look at it and go, yeah, I guess that makes sense. And literally nobody remembers it 30 seconds later.
Right. Well, this has been fantastic, Adam. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your energy. I've been a fan of your work for many years, and I'm glad that we got to spend some time today. So thank you.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
To learn more about Thought Leadership Leverage, please visit our website at thoughtleadershipleverage.com. To reach me directly, feel free to email me at peter@thoughtleadershipleverage.com. And please subscribe to Leveraging Thought Leadership on iTunes or your favorite podcast app to get your weekly episode automatically.